We now have a dialog created. We have the controls, we have the buttons in place, but clicking on the buttons doesn't do anything. Clicking the refresh button should display a list of all the objects in the scene, and clicking cancel should close the dialog. Obviously, this doesn't happen yet. In this part of the tutorial, we're going to be looking at connections, more specifically signals and slots in Qt. When I click the cancel button, for example, a signal is emitted. Now, if we have a connection, whenever the cancel button itself is clicked, the slot code will be executed. It's probably best to demonstrate how this works. I'm going to begin with defining the slots, the code that's run whenever the cancel button is clicked or the refresh button is clicked. In the case of the refresh button, I'm just going to create a method called refresh. And for now, I'm just going to print refresh, just so you can see what's happening. I will also create a method for closing the dialog. In this case, a slot already exists for the dialog. I should say a method already exists on the dialog to close it, and that's simply close. So now, I don't have a connection yet. When this method is executed, the dialog will close. To make the connections themselves, I'll create a new method called createConnections. With Qt, there's a method called connect that's associated with any of the widgets. In this case, calling connect, I want to start with the refresh button. So this is going to be the widget itself that emits the signal. And I need to add the name of the signal, which is going to be clicked. And finally, the name of the slot that will be called when the signal occurs. For the refresh button, this is simply refresh. Now I need to add the createConnections call to the init method. This way the connections are actually made when the dialog itself is created. Right now I only have a refresh connection, but when I click refresh, you will see that refresh is printed up in the output window. Next, I'll make a connection to the cancel button. And again, call qtcore.signal along with the name of the signal. Now, clicked is a standard signal for any push buttons. This should be closed dialog. And again, if I execute the code, clicking refresh will obviously print refresh. Clicking cancel closes the dialog now. We know the refresh method is working correctly. It's printing out refresh. But we now want it to actually update the selection list. For that, we'll need a new method. I'm going to entitle update selection. And this method is going to be called by refresh. So we no longer need to print refresh. We just want to call self.updateSelection. And this is going to handle all of the Maya code, querying the selected objects in the scene and populating the list widget with those items. I'm first going to need to import Maya commands, simply import maya.cmds as MC. This will allow me to query the scene for selected objects. Back in the update selection method, first I want to clear the selection list. If anything exists in the list, it needs to be removed first. So self.selectionList.clear. This will remove any items from the list. Next, I'll query the scene for any selected objects. Selected equals mc.ls and pass the flag selection equals true. This will return any selected objects currently in the scene. I'll now iterate over the list and add each item to the selection list widget. So first SEL in selected. I'm going to create an item, which is a queue list widget item. A queue list widget doesn't just hold a list of strings, it holds something known as a list widget item. This allows you to store a name along with any user-defined data that you may want to use. For now, we're just going to be setting the item name when we create the object. So we're going to pass in the current item in the selected list. Next, I need to set the item editable. This will allow a user to double-click on the item and change the name of it. So I need to set flags. I'm going to first get a list of the current flags, and I'm going to append an extra flag onto it. In this case, I'm using item is editable flag. Finally, I'll add the new item to the selection list. Now when I run the code, the renaming dialog is empty. If I click refresh, it still doesn't do anything. I'll close down charcoal, and I'll actually make a selection. I'll select all 4 objects. When I click refresh, the dialog is now populated. And from here I can double click and I can change the name. Unfortunately, changing the name is only changing the name in the dialog itself. It's not changing the name of the objects. So in the next part, we're going to look at actually updating the scene when a user changes the name. Before moving on, I'd like to quickly add one thing. Right now, when I open the dialog, it's empty. When I click refresh is when the list is updated. We want the list to update when the dialog is created as well. That way the user doesn't have to click refresh every time. To do this, I'm simply going to call self.refresh in the init method. This will populate the dialog automatically when it's created.